Last time we had been talking about Buddhism, but we were focusing entirely on the monastic, or what's sometimes called sectarian Buddhism. During this early period, from say roughly around 500 BCE to about 100 CE, Buddhism was purely monastic. And at that time, it had a very limited set of images and also text to a certain extent. But all that is about to change. Now, while Buddhism was basically monastic, we saw primarily minimal forms, stupas, and forms like these chatai halls, which have stupas in them, visually symbolizing the Buddha and the beliefs of Buddhism. We mostly had like lions or images of wheels that symbolize the teaching. Sometimes footprints would symbolize the presence of the Buddha. Very limited in form. But around, well, actually at the fourth council, there were 6 different councils of Buddhism. The last one was actually held in 1956. The first council was held right after the death of Shakyamuni. The most important were the first and the fourth. The first was merely to establish, what is this Buddhism and what are the texts that are important, very much like the beginning of Christianity, where we talked about those early meetings searching for, well, what is this and what are our beliefs and what are the texts that we read, etc. But the fourth is important. The fourth was held just before 100 CE. And in the Fourth Buddhist Council, that's where this new type of Buddhism was officially recognized. And it's known as, or was known as, Mahayana Buddhism. And that's, excuse me, I need a drink. That's what we're going to talk about right now. And I sent out a handout on Mahayana. Mahayana Buddhism, wait a minute. Here it is. Is really a continuation of all of the beliefs of early Buddhism. None of that changes. All those things we saw early are still true. But Mahayana, which means the greater vehicle, yana means vehicle, Maha means greater or actually larger, changes its emphasis away from just being about personal enlightenment to what is sometimes called the bodhisattva ideal. And a bodhisattva is not a new concept either, but its meaning changes dramatically in that first century. Its focus is on 2 new things, 2 ideas, prajna and karuna. Prajna means wisdom and karuna means compassion. And the 2 of those are always together. They're always sort of 2 sides of the same thing. There are a lot of sort of objects that are used in Buddhist practice that physically have a symbol on one side that symbolizes compassion and a symbol on the other side that symbolizes wisdom. The bodhisattva ideal is centered around the existence of this being called a bodhisattva, which it literally means enlightened one, but it's not a Buddha. Bodhisattva, the definition I have here, which is usually the words that are used, a bodhisattva is an enlightened being who has chosen to forego his or her, and I have to change that to their, personal enlightenment in order to assist others on this path. Now, that's a very paradoxical statement because it suggests that enlightenment is like a door that you step through. And once you're through that door, you no longer interact with the physical world, which is certainly not the case, because Shakyamuni Buddha was enlightened being and he taught for his whole life. So we have to understand that it's not really a physical thing that you somehow hold back from enlightenment so that you can help others. It's really a metaphor for the idea of selflessness or the idea of compassion with wisdom. And we're going to run into lots of bodhisattvas. And it's our job then as practitioners to live up to that ideal, to find that ideal and seek a way to live our lives. So we're going to see lots and lots of images of bodhisattvas and talk about that later. Now, I want to talk about this terminology of the earlier Buddhism. When Mahayana began, it started calling earlier Buddhism Hinayana, which means the lesser vehicle. Now, it wasn't meant as a pejorative term. It's only been taken as pejorative in the contemporary world, where practitioners today of earlier practices don't like to use the word Hinayana because they believe it has negative associations. That's because in the West, the word greater and lesser is not a measure of quantity, but a measure of quality to a great extent, implying it's less important. But that isn't what was really meant by the term. It actually meant it was a smaller vehicle. It only dealt with you, one person, as opposed to something reaching out to a vast number of people. Today, we use the word Theravada to refer to those remaining practitioners of the early sectarian Buddhism, and they're no longer necessarily monks. That's correct today, but it's not really correct to use the term Theravada when you're speaking about the past. There were originally 19 schools, sectarian Buddhism. All have died out except for one. And the one that still remains is the Theravada school. So if you're talking about it today, it is correct to call it Theravada. But if you're talking about it historically, it is not correct, because then you're leaving out the other 18 branches. So anyway, if you're confused by the terminology, I'll use the term Theravada. In addition to embracing this idea of compassion and selflessness, there were, as you can see, 6 what we call the perfections, or paramitas, 6 qualities that you should aspire to. And I have them listed there, things like generosity and morality, patience, energy, meditation, wisdom. These aren't like commandments. What they are qualities to which you should aspire. You know, if a bodhisattva has these qualities and you wish to be that kind of person, then you should be generous and you should be compassionate, etc. One thing I want to sort of comment on, because it's going to come up symbolically in art a lot, and that is this thing called the Trikaya doctrine, which is new to Buddhism, and it's going to very much inform particularly architecture, but other sorts of forms as well. It's not as complicated as it seems when you just read it. Trikaya means 3 body. Think of it as 3 tiers. 3 tiers of existence. And all of the figures and forms, you know, the paintings and sculptures that we're going to see, all those figures exist in one of these 3 levels. The highest level is the Dharmakaya. That's basically what's sometimes called the truth body. That's basically Buddha nature. That's very esoteric. It's very hard to understand. It's purely a concept of Buddha nature. The middle layer down, the Sambhogakaya, almost everything we're going to look at comes from that level. All of the Buddhas and all of the Bodhisattvas and all of the archetypal beings, they all exist in the Sambhogakaya level. The lower level, the Nirmanakaya, that is the form body. That is beings that exist physically in the real world. So Shakyamuni Buddha. So you have 1 or 2 figures on the lower level, 1 or 2 figures on the upper level, and everybody else in the middle. So these are basically referencing whether an idea is physically manifested, whether then it's in the Nirmanakaya. If it's archetypally or metaphorically manifested, then it's in the Sambhogakaya. And if it's almost formless or beyond physical manifestation, then it's in the Dharmakaya, then it's in this very ephemeral realm. And this, as I said, we'll come back to this when we look at particularly architecture and also mandalas that reference this. And then the other thing that we're going to see a lot of are the 5 transcendent Buddhas, and they come out of the Mahayana. They didn't really exist before. They're related to later texts. The 5 transcendent Buddhas we're going to encounter not only in India, particularly in Tibet, but also in China, in Japan, in Southeast Asia. These are 5 Buddha figures. They're what we would call archetypal figures. And each one of them represents a distinct aspect of Buddha nature, different. And when you put the 5 together, you have this complete symbolic reference to Buddhist ideas. You see them most in esoteric Buddhism, but it's a basic Mahayana. And individual sects have developed around several of them. Vairocana and Amitabha we're going to encounter later. It's Amoghasiddhi, Ratnasambhava, Akshobhya, Amitabha, and Vairocana. As you can see, they each have certain associations. They each have a direction, north, south, east, west, and center. Notice Vairocana is in the center. He's the most important of them. They each have a color, and Vairocana is white, which is the most important color because it's a combination of all of them. They each have an element, they each have a mudra, and remember, a mudra is a hand gesture that's associated with them. They each have a bodhisattva associated with them. And Samantabhadra is associated with Vairocana. Samantabhadra is one of the few figures that exists in the Dharmakaya. Samantabhadra is not archetypal, but it symbolizes Buddha nature itself. So that identifies Vairocana as more important. You also see they each have a particular transformed emotion. In other words, some negative emotion that they can transform. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, please.
But are we supposed to be seeing more than one screen? Because we've only got one screen and
no, you're not.
You can see.
Okay, I was referring to the handout that I sent out.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll dig that right.
That's okay. No problem. No problem. And if anybody didn't get that, please do leave me a note or something so I can see and send them out to you. Make sure you're on the email list. But there's an image in the handout of the 5 of them and a little chart that shows.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's not a problem at all. I should have mentioned it, but that's where it's sort of all listed. And if you see this, you can see that under the transformed emotions, the bottom 3, they're anger, desire, and ignorance. Those are the 3 poisons that we talked about last time we were together when we were looking at these sort of basic 3 negative energies. And if you add 2 more to them, if you add envy and pride, then you get what are sometimes called the 5 hindrances. And each one of these 5 figures is associated with one of those 5 hindrances, and they're able to transform them. And we'll talk about that when we come to specific images, but you can see they're all 5 down there in this image, and they're all 5 different colors associated with the colors above. Then Mahayana will then expand into all these other types of Buddhism that we're going to see. Vajrayana in Tibet, Tendai and Shingon in Japan, which are esoteric sects. We're going to talk about Pure Land Buddhism in China and again in Japan, and Chan in China, which is also known as Zen in Japan. All those are Mahayana practices. So Mahayana not only spreads out to a greater community and is no longer limited to monastic communities, but this is what is going to spread out of India into China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Korea, etc., where there is some spread of the earlier sectarian Buddhist monastic practices as well to Southeast Asia, but not a lot. Okay, so now corresponding to the development of this new kind of Buddhism, which is, broader ideals and the like, is finally the culmination of something that's been building for 100 or more years, and that is sort of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road is really a misnomer. It's not a road. It's a term that refers to a vast array of trading routes that run not only on overland across Asia and into Europe, but also sea routes. So there's no one Silk Road. It's a sort of a general term. As you can see, there are many, many Silk Roads, but the final sort of opening up of East and West happens between this period of about, from in some parts of it were open as early as 200 BCE, but by 200 CE, you've got trade happening all the way from the capitals of China, all the way to Asia Minor, which is Byzantium over here. And there were land routes that went to even the Roman Empire. There's no question that there was connection between the Roman Empire and India by 200. So this is going to open up everything, and it's going to bring Buddhism out of India. Even as it's dying out in India, it's spreading along the Silk Road. And it not only went east, but it went west as well. There used to be a considerable Buddhist presence throughout the Middle East, but that has been completely largely wiped out. You know, as Islam spreads east, you see Buddhism sort of disappearing, but there was a period when it was spreading west as well. There were a number of Alexander's men, in fact, that had converted to Buddhism.
Peggy,
anyway, let's
before
talk.
you leave, can I steal 2 minutes? Because this is a
Sure.
great map. And you can see, if you look at the Arabian Peninsula there, and kind of at the bottom of it, there's kind of two major trades, you know, port cities, trade centers at the bottom.
Right
and
here.
then about halfway up the continent on the western edge is going to be Mecca, is one of the cities in there. And then you see all the connections up through Jerusalem and Byzantium and so on. So the only way to get, well, you could travel by sea if you could afford it, but if you were offloading goods at those southern ports in the peninsula then it would be caravans. It would be camel travel through the desert to get to Mecca and then to Jerusalem and to the connections to Byzantium. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about some of the stuff that Muhammad is responding to, is that that triangle there between those port cities and Mecca and how that trade happened. So thank you for that map.
Yeah, I just found, I have like a million of these maps, and I just found this one. It's a fairly new one, and it's my favorite of the Silk Road maps. It's really complete. But yeah, this is what we're talking about in the Wednesday class, people. So if you're not coming to that, you should come to that, because we always have lots of overlap between these classes and what's going on there. But yeah, this is exactly that route. You can also see the route from sort of the Indus Valley right here, right here, sorry, and how there was this trade up to Mesopotamia we were talking about last time, going right through here. You can see, you know, India, you basically come in from the northwest on land, mostly sea routes in India. This is all these mountains up here, stopping the trade. But yeah, I love maps. You see so much. Okay, so what is happening now in this part of India? A group of people, largely Indo-European nomadic peoples again, known as the Kushans, moved into the area. We know that they originally were probably from around somewhere up in the area of Mongolia, but they have been traveling around Central Asia for quite a while, settled first in Bactria. Bactria is basically basically Afghanistan is roughly where Bactria is. And then they moved down in to control this gateway into India. And the Kushans converted to Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, fairly early. In fact, Kanishka, the king, is the one who sponsored that fourth Buddhist council that established Mahayana Buddhism formally. They set up two capitals, one in Gandhara, which is a region, not a city. The Gandhara region is in the northwest, and the Gandhara region always had a lot of classical influence. Classical meaning Greco-Roman, the remains of Alexander's army. In fact, there was a power gap in this part of India. Alexander's men started as early as 300 BCE, they started falling back from India. Alexander didn't really stay very long in India, but he left a lot of Greeks behind, and they formed a kind of Greco-Bactrian empire that controlled much of this area for the next 300 years. Well, they had just fallen, and these nomadic Kushan people moved in and filled that gap. So they're very much influenced by classical tradition and sort of Greco-Roman tradition. We also know that they had trade delegations with the Roman Empire during the 2nd century, and that was when Rome was at its height under Trajan, for example. So they're getting Greek and Roman influence. And then they had a secondary capital way down here in Mathura, which is not connected to the classical past. And what's going to happen is 2 very distinct styles are going to develop in these 2 places. And what I'm talking about is the style of Buddha images. We have seen, and there have been no images of Buddha as a man before Mahayana Buddhism. With Mahayana, we get this explosion of potential imagery, all these archetypal Buddhas, all these bodhisattvas, and the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, and all these other Buddhas as men. And so this is when it begins. And fairly early on, a certain sort of motif developed on how you show the Buddha as a man. There were 32 outward signs, most of them not really that visible. So we tend to focus on 3 or 4. One of them is the Ushnisha, which is this sort of knob on the top of the head. Now, these are characteristics of an enlightened being, not of a Buddha, because a bodhisattva will have them as well. So just because they have these doesn't tell you it's a Buddha figure. There are other ways to tell the difference. The Ushnisha is not a hair bun. It's symbolically and actually an extension of the brain. It's a symbolic bulge on the top of your head that signifies the state of enlightenment. Now, they didn't believe that people got knobs on their heads if they got enlightened. It's purely a metaphor to symbolize sort of an expanded mind. The other usually visible characteristic is the urna, which is, you sometimes read it as a dot, between the eyebrows. It's actually a swirl of hair, and that comes from the Lotus Sutra, in which there's a story that the Shakyamuni Buddha was teaching or giving a teaching, and it's like 1,000 people, and then for whatever reason, this light comes out of the middle of his forehead and shoots over all the people, and 1,000 people are all enlightened at once. It's a story, it's a mythic story, but that urna, or that dot, signifies that moment, or it symbolizes, I should say, that moment of enlightenment. The elongated earlobes are always a characteristic of enlightenment, and that goes back to the actual man, Siddhartha, Gautama, who Shakyamuni was before his enlightenment. He was a prince, remember, and he was wealthy. And a sign of wealth in India was elongated earlobes, because you wore earrings, and you wore solid gold earrings, and gold is very, very heavy. And if you wear solid gold earrings all your life, your earlobes are going to be hanging way, way down. So it's an interesting kind of symbol, because it really doesn't have a spiritual context. It has a very physical one in the fact that that man actually had long earrings. So it's just a symbol of Shakyamuni. It's a symbol of where he came from. But again, it loses its original association and just becomes associated with enlightenment. The other thing you sometimes see and sometimes don't are the chakras. Chakra simply means wheel. It's a Sanskrit word for wheel. We know that's an important Buddhist symbol, symbolizing the teachings. So you'll sometimes see the chakra on his feet, or sometimes on his hands, but usually not. Generally, he's seated in its dhyana position, a meditation position, with the sun and the moon disk behind him, 2 disks. This is the sun disk, this is the moon disk. He's usually seated on a symbolic lotus opening up. A lotus is also a symbol of purity, actually, because it's a beautiful white flower that grows out of the mud. So it's symbolized with enlightenment and purity. And we're going to see many of those. Now, two styles are going to develop: the Gandhara style, which is very Western in influence, and the Mathura style, which is a purely Indian style. Oh, that's right. I've got my, okay. One of the earliest things we have from the Kushan dynasty are coins, and I love these coins. This is Kanishka on the left, and you can see he's not dressed in Indian clothes. This is from somebody who's from the north. He's got a very heavy clothes and big heavy boots. Their language was a kind of mixture of it sort of has a lot of Greek mixed into it. They borrowed a lot of Greek letters and mixed it into the language. So I can't read it, but I see a lot of Greek letters. This is another Kanishka, but the ones I love are these, where you have clearly, you can read using Greek letters, B-O-D-D-O or delta, delta O, Bodo, and Bodo is clearly a Buddha. So this is one of the earliest depictions of a standing Buddha figure. You can see the sun and the moon disk. You can see these elongated ears. They look more like elephant ears. They're really, really big. But these are early, and down here as well. I just love this Bodo. And then other symbols they used are not Greek at all. I have no idea what that means. So we're seeing on coins early Buddha images. This one also early. This is one of 4 images from a long relief. It depicts the assault of Mara's host, and we're going to see other examples of this subject. It's from the Enlightenment of Shakyamuni. It refers to a moment just before his enlightenment. He's just about to be enlightened. And Mara is not a being. Mara symbolizes, sometimes he's called a demon. Mara symbolizes all of the kind of evil forces that are trying to draw his attention away from his meditation, to keep him from being enlightened. So in art, sometimes it's depicted as a bunch of arrows coming in, because arrows like get your attention and draw your focus. In this case, it's like a marauding group of beings that are saying, hey, over here, stop meditating, just trying to break his attention and focus. And the monkeys are important. We've got the little monkeys. You'll often see monkeys. Monkeys symbolize monkey mind, and monkey mind is another way of talking about distractions in your mind. When your mind is running wild and you can't stop thinking about things and you can't quiet your mind, you have monkey mind. Because, monkeys swing through the trees and grab on this and they swing over there, and they're just kind of chaos. So monkeys symbolize that. And in the midst of all of this chaos, this sort of temptation, he reaches down with his right hand and touches the earth. And that's what's called the Bhumisparsa, or the earth touching mudra. And what he does is he touches the earth, and he calls upon the earth to witness. He's basically saying, I'm calling upon the earth to witness. I will not allow you to break my concentration. I won't be disturbed. So earth touching or calling on the earth, it's called all those things, but it's a key moment, in a sense, in the process of his enlightenment. Now, the style is very much a Gandhara style. He has on a very heavy robe. Buddhas, whether they're Shakyamuni or whether they're one of the many archetypal Buddhas, they always wear a simple robe, a simple monk's robe. Nothing more, no jewelry, no crowns, nothing elaborate. And this is usually how you can tell a Buddha from a Bodhisattva, because a Bodhisattva will be wearing other things. They'll often have jewelry and necklaces or even crowns, but never a Buddha. And it's very heavy drapery. You see the folds, that's classical. You can also see a lot of detail in his hair. You can see every little hair as it's moving. That's also classical. Here's a standing Gandhara Buddha wearing his Sangati, and I thought I'd put the name on there. It'll come up later, the robe that he's wearing. Again, it's very heavy with a lot of folds. This is actually a beautiful Gandhara Bodhisattva in the Nelson Gallery. really beautiful one from this time period. It's not life size. It's probably about 4 feet tall or 4.5 feet tall. But again, there's a lot of detail. You can see every little hair. You can see all the folds of the drapery. This is a Roman figure, and this is the sort of figure, people talk about the Greek influence, but, Greeks didn't wear robes like that. Romans did, and they certainly had Roman representatives. So it's Greco-Roman, but again, it's those heavy, heavy folds. There's the Sangati, there's the term. Sangati is a monk's robe. Remember, a Sangha is a community of monks, and a Sangati is the robe, the monk's robe. Also in the face here, you can see the hair a little better. Now the face is very different. In Greco-Roman, you're going to get naturalism. We don't have that here. It's always going to be very stylized, but you do see the detail in the hair here. Now the Mathura style is going to be different. That's going to develop in a place that is away from the classical influence. And it's in fact this Mathura style which will continue, which will be influential, because this is the purely Indian style. And this is a very well-known seated Buddha with attendants in the Mathura style. And what we recognize right away is different is that robe. He is wearing a Sangati, but it's clinging to the body. It's very minimal and only sort of vaguely referenced to folds. There's no detail at all in the hair. It's a much more about the body and the sensuous body. This motif, the sort of triad with a seated Buddha in the center and then 2 bodhisattvas, 1 on each side, that becomes a very common motif, and we're going to see that everywhere. This beautiful symmetry creates a very calm and peaceful image, because it is symmetrical, and symmetry is, by its very nature, stable and calm. The bodhisattvas you could recognize with their sort of crowns and necklaces, jewelry, that tells us they're bodhisattvas. He has his hands is sort of broken off a bit, but he is in the Abhaya mudra, which is the fear not mudra. This mudra comes from a story. It's actually from one of the Jataka tales. One of the stories of from the pre-incarnation of Shakyamuni, sort of in his earlier lives. There's a story where he was traveling to this town and there was a wild elephant in this town, and it was running around and stomping on people, and he walked up to the elephant and put his hands up and said, "Don't be afraid, fear not," and the elephant immediately quieted down and kneeled down so he could rub his head. And so that gesture, that mudra, fear not, really comes from that. That's the story anyway of where it comes from, and we'll see that quite a lot. Down below, you see it's broken off, so you can't really see the sun and moon disk. They're not in very good shape. Down below his sort of seat, we see other figures, including these 2 figures right here, these 2 leogryphs. It's not a griffin, it's a joining of a lion and a griffin, and they're placed symmetrically facing outward. There is a considerable tradition. Oh, okay, this I was having trouble getting my PowerPoints to save everything, and this PowerPoint didn't save all of my slides because I had extra slides in there to reference this tradition. When we look, if you were with us in the previous course, when we looked at art from the ancient Near East, Assyria in particular, one of the things we saw were these guardian figures of fantastic animals. They were part lion, a part eagle, and they were always 2 of them, and they were symmetrically placed on like either side of a doorway, for example. I mean, when you think of the lions outside of an art gallery, the famous 2 lions at the Chicago Art Institute, or things like that. They go back to that ancient tradition. And in India, we see the same tradition. We know they were in contact with the Middle East. That's a Middle Eastern form. And whenever we see it somewhere, we know where it came from. We know who's been in contact with who. So again, we get and it implies guardianship. It implies they are guardian figures. So we see fantastic animals here as guardians. One last sort of brief moment of Buddhism to talk about, and that is during India's golden age. The Gupta dynasty is not only India's golden age, it's also the last great age of Buddhism in India. This is where we see the last things being made. The Gupta themselves were actually Hindu practitioners, but they sponsored Buddhist sites, they sponsored Brahmanic sites, or actually not that much yet, and also Jain sites. So we're going to talk briefly about Jainism in a moment. So they sponsored religious sites for various religions. This was a period, a great golden age. A Chinese traveler actually who visited India during the Gupta period wrote about how impressed he was with its prosperity, its contentment, its magnificent cities, its hospitals, and its seats of learning. So this was a flowering of art and literature in India and religions because of that. So it was quite opulent during this period. We're going to look now at something really, I think, one of the finest pieces of art, of Buddhist art from India, comes from Sarnath, one of the holy cities. This is the area where Buddhism is sort of centered, both Gaya, Sarnath, and it's this piece, which I think is one of the most beautiful pieces of Indian art that we have. It's sort of the culmination of developing Buddhist styles. It's a seated Buddha. It depicts the first turning of the wheel, and I'll tell you in a minute how we know that. It's made out of chunar, which is this really beautiful cream-colored sandstone material in India. Whether it's for sculpture or whether it's for architecture, varies depending on the geology of the region. There are certain parts of India where everything is made out of sandstone, including the buildings, other parts where it's granite, other parts where it's more a volcanic stone. India is quite varied in that way. So a really beautiful piece. In this case, we have a single seated figure. It's the Sarnath style, or it's sometimes called the Sarnath Gupta style. It's influenced clearly by the Mathura style, as we'll see in just a moment. Let's see, here's our Mathura style. So you don't really see, the drapery is just clinging to him. He is wearing something, but all you see is a line here. There's a little line around the wrist, but it basically clings to the body with a few little striations. We have the sun and moon disk behind him. Now the Bodhi tree, typically there will be something symbolizing a tree or vegetation. Remember, he was enlightened under the Bodhi tree, or the tree of enlightenment. So instead of like showing a tree, typically there'll be something like this with vines or leaves swirling around that just symbolize that. And in this case, it's a very stylized vegetation. And here the sun and the moon disk overlap. So we've got the sun disk and then a smaller behind it. And the bodhisattvas are now small little figures, more flying in the sky. There are some interesting deer. There are deer here and here. They're not leogryphs. These are just deer. And that's because it symbolizes the first teaching, or the first time he taught, which took place in a place called Deer Park. So you'll typically see deer because of where it took place. Now, we know that this is the first turning because of his mudra. One-handed mudra like this symbolizes teaching. And when monks are teaching, they will do this. When you have two of those like this, that's the Dharma Chakra mudra. And that means it's the first teaching, or the first turning of the wheel. The metaphor of teaching in Buddhism is turning the wheel of Dharma. And so he's holding it like this. Now, technically, only Shakyamuni should ever be using that mudra, because it really refers to a specific person doing something at a specific time. But it isn't 100% the case. But one hand like that is just teaching. Below, we have the Dharma wheel, and these are sort of disciples or those following him. His face is perfectly and completely calm now. This is sort of the ultimate expression of this moment. His eyes are not completely closed, because you're not really supposed to have your eyes closed when you meditate. They're almost closed. His hair, instead of like showing every little hair like we saw in the Gandhara style, it's not completely smooth like the Mathura either. It's now coalesced into what we sometimes call snail curl hair. So each one of these looks like a little curl, like a snail. And that is the final sort of development of the style. But really, really beautiful piece. And this Gupta style is going to have a huge impact on Hindu art and Hindu style as well. And there's our Mathura figure again. Before we leave Buddhism, I want to look at one additional site. And that is a cave site at Ajanta. Now, we've seen two other cave sites. We saw Karli is the last. We saw Karli and others not too far from Karli, but the Ajanta site is the most important and the most beautiful, and the most recently discovered site as well. It dates from the 2nd to the 7th century. We know that the latest structures there are 7th century. This is a riverbed. I'll show you a plan of it in a minute. And this is the site of the heel, and caves were cut into this site. Now, this whole location was actually discovered in 1817. It was completely overgrown. This vegetation had completely overgrown it. You couldn't see a thing. And there were some soldiers out on a tiger hunt, and they were walking through here, tracking a tiger. I wouldn't want to be walking through here tracking a tiger, but nonetheless, they pulled some vegetation apart and found a cave. And then they found more and more and more. So it was accidentally sort of discovered. It's a beautiful site. It's a major tourist site today, as you can imagine. It had been abandoned since the 7th century, however. This is a plan. You can see how the riverbed here carved out those spaces. These date, some of them are early, some late. They're numbered from here 1 through 28, but that's not their age. We numbered them by location just so we can talk about them. But it's very likely these little ones are some of the latest. Probably the bigger ones were dug out, and then, well, there's a gap here, so let's squeeze in some little ones. Is probably how it was done. As sites we saw before, this was a massive monastery site. We know that about 300 monks lived here at its height. It has 4 chatai halls, and we'll look at that in a moment. We've already looked at earlier chatai halls. You can see there are 2 of them right here. You can recognize them on the plan. Remember, they're long and they have this stupa at the end, so this round circle. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are chatai halls. And then all these others are viharas. This is where the monks lived. Remember, these are just sort of like dormitory places. But this is sort of the height of building. As we saw with other chatai halls, the entranceways are carved as beautiful palace entrances. And then when you get inside, and this is the most opulent of all, both the chatai halls and the viharas are really quite opulent at this site. Now, I must say this photograph has been beautifully artificially lit with these beautiful amber lights to create this effect. You know, it wouldn't quite look this romantic, but it is richly carved. And the stupa is really ornate compared to the very simple ones we saw before. I'll remind you of those in a minute. And sitting right here in the middle of the stupa is a figure of a Buddha, which of course we didn't see before because the earlier stupas were before Mahayana, before there were images of Buddha as a man. We even have an ornate sort of entablature up here. I still can't get my mind away from seeing this as Greco-Roman architecture. It's very much so. But this was built in the same way. Now, here's the 2 earlier ones we looked at. And what a difference. This was the earliest from about 150 BCE, very plain. And then, you know, 250 years later, we get the one at Carly, which is a tiny bit more ornate, but nothing like what we saw a moment ago. Even the viharas, these are the quarters, these sort of rooms filled with columns, even the columns are carved and much more ornate than we had seen before. And remember, these would have been living spaces, communal spaces. They would have had kitchens or places to prepare food, little private shrine rooms, everything you would need to live in there, because this is literally a monastery, these rock cut caves. There's also some painting remaining. Now, they were in really bad shape. Obviously, they've been neglected and left exposed to the elements, but in some of the caves, this was from a vihara, actually, not from a Chatai hall. The viharas were painted, and this is one of the few remaining where you can actually see the form. This is a story from the Jataka tales, from the Mahajanaka Jataka. And remember, the Jataka tales come from the Mahabharata. Again, just, thank your lucky stars. You don't have to be tested on this stuff. You don't have to know these names, but the Mahabharata was was a part of the Vedas. It was one of those epic stories that was written much later in the Vedas. And Janaka was a prince, supposedly pre-incarnation of the Buddha. And so Maha means great. So Raja means king. So Maharaja means the great king. So Mahajanaka means the great king Janaka. So a lot of these Sanskrit words seem really complicated, but if you break them down, they're really several little short words that each has a meaning put together. So Mahajanaka Jataka isn't as complex as it seems. Now, this is a bodhisattva. So he's wearing the crown. His bodhisattva Padmapani. Padmapani means lotus holder. Padma means lotus. So Padmapani means a lotus holder, and it's a sign of a particular person. I'm not going into the story because these stories are really long and complicated, and I don't even know what moment in the story this is. But this would have been basically like a fresco painted on wet plaster, and so it's preserved in the same way. Although, as I said, most of it's not. This is a rare preservation. Yeah, Peg?
I'm confused. I thought Vedas had to do with Hindu.
That's right.
What was Hindu? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
The Vedas have to do with Hinduism, and we're talking Buddhism here. So
Buddhism is still rooted in the Vedas. They use the same stories, and they're just interpreted differently. In the original Mahabharata, these stories were adventure stories of princes. When Buddhism comes along, they become stories of the pre-incarnations of the Buddha. So it's the same stories, and it's also rooted in the Vedas.
It's much like you would have a Christian adaptation of the Old Testament stories with the idea that, oh, this was really predicting the coming of Jesus, right? So
yes.
So the Veda stories are really the pre-incarnations of the Buddha, but
right.
They existed long before Buddhism came along.
Exactly. In fact, they're not much of, let me go back to this, much of, Hinduism doesn't really exist. Hinduism is going to really change. What we think of Hinduism is quite a ways away from the Vedas, at least the original Vedas. Hinduism comes out of these later additions to the Vedas. We're going to talk about that actually in just a few minutes. But yes, the Mahabharata, the scenes from the Ramayana, they will all appear in Buddhist art. So yeah, the Vedas technically aren't Hindu or Buddhist. They predate both of those concepts and become source stories. This Padmapani is a form of Avalokiteshvara, and we're going to talk about him. Avalokiteshvara is the most important of all bodhisattvas. He is the bodhisattva of infinite compassion and has many avatars, one of which is female. This is another avatar, Padmapani. That idea of avatars, like quadruples everything else. You know, if you have 100 gods and they each have 100 avatars, how many beings are there out there which you could depict? And how many people would recognize them if they saw them? Not very many, I guarantee you. Right outside, this is another source from the Vedas. Right outside the Ajanta cave is this figure of the Naga king. And we're going to be talking about the Nagas more because they're important figures, yes, in Hinduism and yes, in Buddhism. And they come also from the Mahabharatas. They're not related to the Jataka tales. They're not related to the former lives of Shakyamuni, but nonetheless, they're from the Mahabharata. The Nagas are really interesting characters. They're associated with snakes. They're sometimes depicted as part snake, part man or woman. And there were 4 principal Naga kings. And sometimes there's so many stories about them. They're sometimes beneficent creatures. They can be dangerous creatures, but they're going to appear in a number of ways. So I'll point them out. One way you recognize a Naga is, well, sometimes he's literally a snake, but often you'll see this 7-hooded cobra. It's like a cobra hood, but it's actually 7 different hoods. In Buddhism, this is taken to symbolize one particular Naga that shielded Shakyamuni Buddha. The story goes, while he's sitting meditating under the Bodhi tree, this cobra sort of rises up and shields him while he's sleeping. For supposedly he fell asleep for a year, you know, so many stories, and meditated for a year. And during that year, this Naga rose up and protected him. So the idea of this hooded figure has a protective meaning in Buddhism. It means something totally different, as we're going to see in just a few minutes, in Hinduism, but it's the same form. We're going to see Nagas all over the place. I don't want to say too much about Jainism as a religion, because the truth is I don't know a whole lot about Jainism, but Jainism developed at the same time as Buddhism. In fact, the founder, Mahavira, was a contemporary of Shakyamuni. It has, as a religion, it has characteristics of both Hinduism and Buddhism. I think it's a little closer to Buddhism, but it's sort of an extreme asceticism, where Buddhism was about finding the middle way. Jainism is more extreme. In fact, its founder, Mahavira, literally starved himself to death. He died from starvation. You know, it's total deprivation. I know that there are Jains, there are about 4 million Jains today, and almost all of them are in India. Apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently there's a little group of Jains in Canada. But other than that, they're mostly in India. I know that some, at least in the past, there were some that rejected clothing and went around naked. I know for a fact that even today there are some who will walk around with brooms, sweeping paths in front of them because they don't want to kill any being, because there might be a little bug or something. There's some Jains who, well, most Jains will not eat anything that loses its life so you can eat it. And I don't just mean meat, but I mean, if it's a vegetation, if you had to kill that in order to eat it, if you had to pull it out of the ground and kill it, they won't eat it. So they'll only eat things like seeds or things that like fall off of a plant. And don't kill.
You can eat an apple, but not a carrot.
Exactly. An apple is great. And I'm not sure, I don't know about rice, because I think you kill it to pull it out, right? But I know they eat a lot of seeds, but yeah, apples are great, but that's all. So it's the same idea, it's just too extreme. So if it's don't kill at all. I know some always wear masks, like we're doing now. They wear them all the time so that they don't accidentally inhale like a bug and kill it. The Jains are so sort of ascetic that they really don't own personally anything. All of their money goes into the temples. Jain temples are the most beautiful temples in the world because they're the ultimate symbol of the rejection of materialism. And it reminds me a lot of medieval art where it's sort of anti-materialistic. And so you get these beautiful, ephemeral, sort of abstract forms. It's like floats in the air. I have several images of temples, Jain temples. Mount Abu in India is a sacred site for the Jains, and you see a lot of temples there. And this is one of them. Let's look at another one. Here's more interior, all carved and rich detail. There are some with figures in them, generally figures of Jains. The Jains are, I didn't even say this, sorry. There are 24 Jinnas. The Jinnas were the 24 founders. Jinna literally means those who overcome. And the last Jinna was the founder Mahavira. He's considered the last or the 24th Jinna. And so you'll see figures of the Jinnas. Here's sort of the dome ceiling. Again, very ephemeral. I didn't count these, but I'll bet there are 24 symbolizing the founders. If somebody's trying to count them, sorry, I'm moving on. And here the sort of undercut. You know, it reminds me a lot of Byzantine art because a lot of the architectural detail in, say, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, the columns and capitals are all deeply carved like this. They're undercut so that it makes it look lightweight. You know, everything was about making it look ephemeral, not physical and heavy. So everything here is trying to look almost like it's non-existent. It dissolves into the cosmos. Everything dissolves. Here's a later, this is a 19th century Jain temple. What I like about this is how it's combining Indian and British influence. I'm seeing a lot of British style here in some of the pavilions, but it's really a beautiful temple. Okay. Finally, let's talk about Brahmanic philosophies. Why is it called Brahmanic? Basically, this is what is known as Hinduism. And again, I've got that handout.
Peggy, can I just mention that Hinduism isn't even a word until the British occupation of India. And it just means the stuff that you find around the Indus River. You know, so there was no self-conscious Hindu faith. It's what the British called all that stuff that they do in India.
That I like to call it Brahmanic because that's sort of where it has to do with the power of the Brahmins. So use that term. But if you've got that handout I sent on Hinduism, it talks about that background to a great extent. Background and stages of development. We talked about this briefly, but broad mix of philosophies and cultures. You know, there's nothing more complicated than India because of all the different peoples who have come and gone. And we've talked about these periods like the Vedic period, like from 1500 up to about 200 BCE, where you have just general influence from the Vedas. You get the second period where you get the influences from the additions to the Vedas. You know, you've got the Vedas, the original four that go back to 1500 BCE. But what happens later is more important than the original Vedas. By 500 BCE, you're getting things like the Upanishads, and it's in the Upanishads that you get the real foundation of Hinduism. What is Hinduism? What we call Hinduism today. And in India, they call it Hinduism too. So it may have started as a British corruption, but it's embraced by Indians now as the name of their religion. So I feel like it's okay to use the term today. All of that is really rooted in the Upanishads, which is an addition to the Vedas, and also the Bhagavad Gita, which is a part of the Mahabharata, actually, and another edition. So you can go back and read that handout on the Vedas if you want. The key concepts that develop as Hinduism. One is the Brahman, and that's why I call it Brahmanic philosophies or religions. The Brahman is hard to describe. It's sometimes referred to as the formless one, the essence of reality. You know, we think of Hinduism as polytheistic. There are many gods and goddesses, but it is understood that each one of those is a discrete manifestation of the Brahman. The Brahman is bigger than that. It's overall. I don't like to use the word God, but it's closer to that. It's a broader concept. And then just as in Buddhism, all these little bodhisattvas and different Buddhas symbolize specific qualities of Buddha nature, the Brahman is like that. That is the big overall reality where other individual forms manifest. The Atman, we'll talk about that in just a second. Well, no, let's do it now. The Atman, which I do talk about here, that, and I don't like to make the comparison to the soul, but if it's easier to understand, it's the individual. It's a piece of the Brahman in the same way that Vishnu is a piece of the Brahman and Shiva is a piece of the Brahman. So are you. So is this thing called the Atman, which is in you. In fact, that's largely why Hindus bow to one another. It's a recognition of the God within you, or the Atman within you. But it's more than that. The Atman, this thing that is you, is also rooted in your caste. And the caste system is very important here. And I talk about that as well. The caste system is a mirroring of the cosmos. It's a mirroring of a structure that's identified in the Vedas, in which there are inherent hierarchies of beings, in which some are identified as having more value than others. And that's also there. I mean, the caste system is not purely social construction. It has a spiritual context and root in the Vedas. And understanding your position and your role and in the ordering of society was an important part of the early teachings in this Vedic period, in this early period before the additions to the Vedas. There are many, many gods and goddesses and symbolic forms. We're going to run into Shakti. We've already run into Shakti. Shakti is used in the context of Buddhism. It's used in the context of Hinduism, the same term, and it simply means the female principle, which is much more prominent in Eastern philosophies than it is in the West. There's always a balance in the East, whatever religion you're talking about. It's generally associated with creativity, but we're going to see, we've already seen it, you know, when we looked at early Buddhism and we saw that Yakshi figure, that sort of nature goddess figure, that's a Shakti, that's a representation of the Shakti principle, the female principle. We're going to see a number of different gods, and they're divided in different ways into different groups. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are often seen together and related to one another because the three of them together symbolize the process of change, the cyclical nature of change. Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the preserver, and Shiva is the destroyer. That's early on in Buddhism. As we get into later Buddhism, that changes. That's another problem, is that it's not stable. You know, these associations and meanings are not stable. They change quite a bit. There's another grouping of three that we often encounter, and that has to do with, they symbolize order. They symbolize the idea of order out of chaos. They balance order and chaos in three different realms. In the celestial realm, the atmospheric realm, and the earthly realm. And these three realms correspond very closely to the Trikaya principle in Buddhism, the idea of there being a celestial realm, that's like the Dharmakaya, the atmospheric realm, that's like the Sambhogakaya, and then the Nirmanakaya, which is the sort of earthly realm. It's very similar the way they parallel one another. And those gods are Varuna, Indra, and Agni. Indra, interestingly, is the king of the gods, But, when you think of mythologies, when we think of like Zeus, the king of the gods, he's like the most powerful. He's the king. Well, Indra is not that not at all. In Hindu philosophy, being the king is much more of an administrative role. It's not like you're in charge. It doesn't mean that. So I often see, if someone refers to Indra as the king of the gods, well, then he must be number one, right? The biggest, the most important. Agni is important on the earthly level, because Agni is, and Soma, who's often depicted with Agni, because they relate to ritual practices, particularly sacrifices. Agni is fire, and Soma is drink, but it's a soporific drink that puts you into this state, and that's important in actual rituals you practice. The Brahmins, okay, there are two paths to spirituality in Hinduism early on anyway. One was the path of the Brahmins. Now the Brahmins, literally that means one who speaks for the Brahman. Remember, the Brahman is this overall undefinable reality. Brahmins are actually people. They're men who have become quite wealthy, and they speak for the Brahman because they are the only ones who can read Sanskrit. They're the only ones who can read the parts of the Vedas that tell you how to do the rituals, how to do the ceremonies and sacrifices. Therefore, they're incredibly powerful. You have to pay them to do rituals and sacrifices. They keep and guard that power. They are the upper caste. They are the highest caste. They're very, very wealthy. The other path to spirituality is the path of the Shramanas. Now, the Shramanas are exactly the opposite. They are the ascetics. They give up everything. They go out and live in caves. That's your other path. You can see these two extremes. This is what Shakyamuni is responding to with Buddhism, and rejecting extremes and embracing the middle way. Much of his teachings is against, this system. But the existence of these two paths are very important. Now let's talk about what happens. This movement that I had talked about, let's see, where do I have it on here? Really, I have it on here. Okay, yes. On the handout, it's on the first page, these stages of development. The early stage, the first stage, just from the early Vedas, focused on ordering of society, that focused on the caste system, knowing your position in society so that we have this balanced society. The second phase, from around 200 BCE, began to focus on personal enlightenment. And this is where you first have references to the Brahman and the Atman. And this idea of your goal is to create a union. So that's the ultimate goal. Moksha means enlightenment for Hindus. Nirvana is a Buddhist word. Moksha is the Hindu word for enlightenment. And what it means is that you merge with God. The idea is that you take this Atman inside of you and you merge it with the Brahman. You form a union. We're going to see this in Hindu art, this desire to join with the God, to be one with your whatever God you're practicing. The most important phase of Hinduism is this third, the so-called Bhakti period. Bhakti means devotion. And beginning around 500 CE, not coincidentally, under the influence of Buddhism, which is 1,000 years old by this time, but it's very influential in the Bhakti movement. What this is people began to form a connection to one particular God. This is when we start getting temples being built to Shiva or to Vishnu, and you choose this one God and you form a relationship with them, and you want to bond with that particular God, to have a oneness with the divine, union with the divine. And this is when finally there is a need under the influence of Buddhism to build things. And this is one of the very earliest. I call it, it's usually called a temple, but I think that's pushing it. I would call it an outdoor shrine. Now, it originally would have had some sort of canopy over it, but it never had side walls per se. It's go ahead and call it a temple at Deogar, associated with Vishnu. In particular, it is the oldest remaining Hindu structure in India, and they said it's from 530. That's CE, so it's not until Bhakti that we begin having things built. Vishnu is the preserver. We're going to look at one sculpture on this. It's a very central symmetrical plan. You have a principal shrine in the center. These were minor shrines on the sides. It's not uncommon in Hindu temples for there to be like one major god, but then have little shrines to other gods as well. What I really want to look at is this. It's actually on here. I don't know which one of these two it is, but it's one of the remaining sculptures. And it's a depiction of Vishnu reclining on the serpent Ananta. And Ananta is one of the 4 Naga kings. So this is a snake he's laying on. We're still in the Gupta period. And so this is being made at the same time that Buddhists are making those beautiful sort of perfected Buddha figures. And this is in the same style. Exactly. So now we've got Vishnu reclining on the coils of Ananta. And these are his coils. What you're seeing here are the sides of the coils that are winding back and forth. So it's like his mattress. In this story, Vishnu sleeps on the Naga who's floating on the milk sea. It has to do with the creation story. As he's sleeping, the cosmos is resting on his shoulders. He's preserving the cosmos, but Shiva will destroy that, and then Brahma will have to recreate it. Now, so he's relaxed. This is Ananta he's lying on. This figure floating up here on this lotus crown, who looks suspiciously like a seated Buddha figure, is actually Brahma, the creator. And normally he's growing on this long stalk that grows out of Vishnu's navel. But in this case, he's not really shown that way. You see the 7-hooded Naga. The Naga stories are very rich. And now this is a completely different story from the one who shielded the Buddha, but now he's shielding Vishnu and protecting him. There's another story, a creation story, that at the time of creation, one of the Nagas was used as a kind of stirring stick to stir up the milk sea, which is the source of all creation. It's very hard to follow these stories because with the Bhakti movement, the roles of the gods change. And let's say your god is Vishnu. Now suddenly Vishnu takes on what to Shiva practitioners Shiva does, but to me now Vishnu does it too. So, they pass around different activities and stories. We've got other gods up here. We've got Indra here who's riding on an elephant. We've got Shiva on his bull, Nandi. We're going to see more about Nandi later, but this is Shiva and Parvati, and there's a servant behind. There's considerable question as to who this figure is. I think all 3 of these are probably servants. Some people have said this is Lakshmi, which is Vishnu's consort, but others have said, no, what she's doing is subservient. And Lakshmi would have never done that. The caste system is very rigid in terms of what you do and don't do. As far as these people down here, believe me, There are many different ideas. There's no agreement whatsoever as to what they symbolize. Some people think they symbolize different weapons because each one is holding something different. But, you know, we don't really know. There are 5 men and 1 woman. But at this point, no scholars are sure at all about what that means. You know, I just reminded you of the other Naga we looked at earlier, where he's like a man with this behind him. Here now the Naga is a full snake with the 7 cobra heads.
Hey, Peggy?
Yeah.
Just in case anybody thinks that the complexity doesn't continue, I'll remind you of in Harry Potter that the snake is named Nagini.
Yeah, Nagini,
and
female Naga.
yes, and in Star Wars you have Padme as a character, you know,
Yeah.
so we continue to draw these images into our own mythology even today.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. They're everywhere. Yeah, you see that. I mean, if you know mythology or history, the Harry Potter stories are entirely different from what other people would read because they're just rich in mythology of East, West, everywhere. And yeah, Nagini is just a female Naga. This is in situ. This is what it looks like in place, or how you would see it on that shrine. Okay, let's go to Elephanta. Elephanta is an island off the coast of Mumbai. And it means just what you think it means. There was originally this big carving of an elephant, a big boulder there. So Elephanta is named for that. And now we find Hindus creating cave sites. Remember, the earliest Buddhist one we saw was 150 BCE. Now we're CE now. So 6th century is the earliest, but it's clearly influenced by earlier Buddhist rock cut caves. In this particular one dedicated to Shiva. When the Gupta dynasty fell apart, much of central India fell into a lot of individual dynasties. You know, it sort of broke down into smaller dynastic units, and we don't really know what dynasty this was. Some dynasty in this area was responsible for supporting this, but it's clearly, you can see it's carved directly back into the rock. Here's a plan of what it looks like. And it's clearly been influenced by Buddhist Vihara caves, because it's like this big room filled with these square columns, you know, all cut out of the bedrock. It has more than one sort of axis or orientation, because there are multiple entrances. This entrance, but you can also enter these directions. So if you enter this way, you have a focus at this end, and we're going to actually look at the sculpture that's back there. If you enter this way, you have an access to a little shrine room here, but you have this long access to the major, what's called the Lingam shrine, and we'll look at that in a minute. Or, you know, you have an access this way, a little shrine over this way. Here are the viharas to sort of remind you of the little side rooms and the like. Now inside, now this is looking down toward the main shrine, or this is the main Lingam shrine. Because this is dedicated to Shiva, it has a Lingam shrine. And in every temple dedicated to Shiva, you will have this that holds the Lingam, which is a stone, a sort of phallic stone. And they're not necessarily realistic phalluses. Sometimes they're just sort of oval stones. It varies. And they usually sit in a yani, which is a symbol of the female form. But that will always be in a Shiva temple, because Shiva is really the symbol of this sort of completeness. Now, there's a lot of sexuality in Hindu imagery, even more so than in Buddhist imagery. And it has to do with the idea of sexual union as a symbol of the union of man and God, as the symbol of the Atman and the Brahman. Female is usually seen as a symbol of the earthly, where the male is the symbol of the spiritual, and Shiva symbolizes that. So sexuality is a spiritual thing in these images. You can see they're fairly elaborate. Now again, this is all bedrock. All of this is carved directly out of the bedrock. I still find that fairly amazing, that you could do this. I mean, you have to have a certain mind to be able to think three-dimensionally to do this. Not many people really could. My favorite part of this site is the sculpture here at the back, the great Mahadeva. And I put an image here with some people so you can get a sense of the scale of this. It's a huge chocolate brown. This sandstone of this site is this beautiful, it's not chunar, it's not creamy, it's more of a rich chocolate brown carving at the back. And it's called the Mahadeva, or the great God, is what the term means. And whenever you hear that reference to the great Shiva or the Mahadeva, it means that he has taken on more than his traditional role. In the traditional role of change, Shiva is the destroyer, right? You've got Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. But sometimes Shiva takes on all three of those. Thanks to the Bhakti movement, now gods are taking on the roles of other gods, making it even more confusing. So let's see what we've got. We've got three faces here, or three heads. We have on the right is a female face. And this is an avatar of Shiva in which Shiva takes on the role of creation as symbolized in a female form. And it has certain characteristics that suggest that in terms of the shape of the lips, it's called a bee-stung lip. So it's like a big swollen lip. This was sort of an ideal of female beauty that symbolized the female. There's sort of a sharp nose as well that identifies that. So this is the aspect of Shiva, that's the creator. Over here, we have the destroyer. It's a male face. He has a mustache and very grim. I know you can't really see it very well, but that's Shiva in his traditional role of destroyer. And in the middle, you have the role that Vishnu would have had, the preserver, where he's sort of like he's sleeping, floating on the sea, as we saw that earlier Vishnu. But because of the influence of Buddhism, it actually takes on the quality of a meditating Buddha. This is basically the same face we saw on that earlier Gupta meditating Buddha figure, but it's now Shiva as the preserver. So the Mahadeva, or the great God, taking on all of the roles. Holy, we have finally a real temple. Now, this is 7th century. This is about the earliest you're going to find a genuine Hindu temple with walls. You know, it's not just an outdoor shrine. Built under the Chalukyas. And you can see it here. It's roughly a square. I'll show you the plan in a minute, with a sort of tower over the center. This is very early. They're going to develop more thoroughly. This is the Lad Khan temple, and the name might suggest be a strange Hindu name. It's that Lad Khan is a reference to, it was given that name much, much later when this area was under Muslim influence. So a Khan has to do with, is a title. So Lad Khan is not a Hindu name, but it's a later name. It was basically a Vishnu temple. It didn't really have that kind of name. And it's based on both the Buddhist viharas, but also it's got its influence from sort of local secular buildings, sort of meeting halls and the like. I mean, it makes sense that that would be influential. So like the Shiva cave, it has what's called a mandapa, and we're going to encounter that in sort of fully developed temples in a little bit. But a mandapa is just basically a big open room filled with these columns, generally square in form. Now, in Hindu temples were not a place for like regular services or anything. You didn't go to like church on Sunday. You weren't in them really that much. They were places for rituals or ceremonies on certain days, and even a lot of those took place outside. Basically, on any ordinary day, it was a place where maybe you as an individual would go into, but it's not a place where there would have been sort of an organized activity for you. You just went in, and you typically circumambulated the shrine, I don't know how long they've been doing that. I don't know whether that predates Buddhism or not. It'd be interesting to know. But in this one, we have one characteristic that we're going to see. This is dedicated to Vishnu, but there's also a Shiva shrine in it, which again is not unusual. This is actually the Lingam shrine associated with Shiva, and directly in front of it we have the Nandi shrine, and this is going to be a regular characteristic. Whenever there's a shrine to Shiva, there's going to in front of it be a shrine to his bull Nandi that he's always depicted with. So the Nandi shrine is right in front and has actually unusually has the place directly under the Shikara. So Shikara is a tower that is usually directly over the Lingam shrine. It will be in later temples. This is early, and so they hadn't, really worked out all the details of how the temples were going to be organized. So this one's a little bit different, but they will have mandapas, they will have a Shikara, and generally at a key spot, there will be a shrine like this. Now, this does have sort of the outer walls, but they're basic. You can't see them very well, but they're carved almost more like a screen. So there's a lot of air moving through them. They're very open. That comes from a lot of sort of secular buildings that were sort of meeting rooms, etc. And the wind could blow through it, keep it cooler. Notice, palm trees. This is the hot part of India. So you want a lot of open area. Really one of the most incredible Hindu sites from this medieval period is one at Ellora, also written Ellora. You're gonna see these words spelled differently. Here I actually spelled it Ellora. That map called it Ellora. It's the same site. The Kailashnath temple, and it's really hard to tell what you're looking at here, isn't it? You'll see in a minute. You're seeing the entranceway that you're going to walk through this and then be amazed at what you see, because this is carved back into the hillside, but it's not really a cave, because this is what you're looking at from the side. It's carved down and completely open. It's not, there's nothing above it, but everything you see here is carved out of the bedrock. Everything. This is the beginning of what's called the Southern Temple style, in which you have a lot of separate structures. Let's see what we've got here. This is our great Gopuram. The idea of a monumental gateway that you pass through will continue in Hinduism. In fact, in late Hinduism, you'll have multiple temples all behind one great gateway. So you go through the gateway and then you have many, many temples. In this case, it's really one temple site, although there are at this location, there are many, many other carvings into the rock. There are actually Buddhist temples there, and there are some Jain temples, all at the same religious site. So a big elaborate Gopuram you go through, and then we have these huge elephants. We'll see all these in just a second. Huge elephants on either side. This is the Nandi shrine, and then we go to the main shrine with the mandapa in front, and then we go in to the Garbhagriha. Garbhagriha actually means womb chamber, literally in Sanskrit. So this is the womb chamber. So it's getting very sexual here. So in here again, we get the lingam with the yoni in a very small space with these very thick walls around it. The sort of metaphor here is a cave. So it's like you're entering a cave. This is completely dark. So that metaphor of a cave continues even when they're building buildings. This is multiple levels. Let's see what we're looking at. This is what it looks like. This is a view from up above looking down. At the far end, it's 120 foot cut down. It's 12 stories carved down into the bedrock to create these rock cut buildings. So you can't really say this was built. It wasn't built. It was carved. The whole thing is an elaborate carving. It's like a giant sculpture that you go inside. And there are smaller versions of things like this in other places, but nowhere is there anything this large. These are, I think this is the Nandi shrine, I think here. You can see it's on different levels and there are stairs going up. All the details cut into it, the steps, the columns, the it still amazes me that anyone could do something like this. This was originally all whitewashed, and don't ask me why they don't still do it, because I don't know. I wish they would, so we could see it, how it was, but they just don't. But originally, imagine this all white, because it was supposed to bring to mind the Himalayas and the mountain home of Shiva. This is where Shiva is from, the Himalayas, and you have snow on the mountains, so it was kept white. I've also seen descriptions of it all white, and then these deep blue shadows, because outside in the bright white sun, the shadows are this gorgeous blue. So it would have been like blue and white colors. It must have been absolutely incredible. This is the Shikara, or the tower, and it's elaborately and detailed carving, 4 levels. These temple styles get complicated, and I'm not going into it, but there are different kinds of capstones and different towers that symbolize different things, and so we don't need to go into that kind of detail. But as a structure, I find that it's sort of bridging this transition from actual caves, then rock cut caves where you go in and carve yourself a cave, and then you have a form like this, which is like a freestanding structure, but it's still carved out of the bedrock. And so, like, what's the next step? It's like you're moving slowly from caves, but the role of the cave, that symbolism of the cave going into the earth, never really stops. You never really completely lose that. And we're going to see a fully developed temple in a minute. Well, probably not today. And I forgot to even take a break. It's a little late now to take a break, but in future, if I get talking and don't stop, please don't hesitate to say, can we take a break now? Sorry. But I do want to look at one last thing, and then that's it. And that's at Mamallapuram, way down here in the south. Now, this is an area where it's mostly granite. And so we're looking at something carved out of granite. This is the Pallava dynasty. They were quite influential in that region. Mamallapuram, Puram in, I don't want to say Indian, because Indian isn't the language, so I'm not, I assume it's still Sanskrit. Puram means city. So you'll see a lot of cities that's something Puram. This literally means the city of Mamal. And Mamal was the king, the founder of the Pallavan dynasty. So the city is named after him, Mamallapuram, or the city of Mamal. Sometimes it's actually called Mahamamallapuram, which just means the great city of the great Mamal. You see, they sound like really long, complicated words, but they're really not when you break them down. This is probably the most visited tourist site in all of India. It's really famous. Let me show you another view. This is I love this print. It's like a 19th century print of this site. You can actually see it better than most photographs. It's 2 gigantic granite boulders. And behind it, above, is a natural pond. And in the rainy season, water fills up the pond and floods down this natural crease right here that's sort of worn away. And one of the scenes depicted is the descent of the Ganges. This is nowhere near the Ganges River, by the way. The Ganges River is way up north, but it symbolizes Mother Ganga. And Mother Ganga, the Ganges Rivers, is a river goddess. And in the story, she descended to earth as this river and was filtered through the hair of Shiva. So Shiva's hair filters the river. So the waterfall each year is Mother Ganga returning to earth, is what it symbolizes. However, there's dozens and dozens of other stories. A lot of people don't like calling it that because that's just one reference. It's full of references from all over the place. You can see I love the big giant elephant as well. From a distance, you can see how large it is. This was actually never finished. It was, a lot of this is not carved, and I think meant to be and never got carved. You can also see that there are rock cut temples all along this area as well. It's not the only thing there. From this angle, you can see some of it a little bit, how it's unfinished here. But let's look at some details. We have a number of different running figures. I doubt if anybody knows what all the stories are, but here's some of my favorite. Right here in the stream, imagine this with the water pouring over it now. What do we have? A naga, the snake form with the man up above, and now the hood. So nagas are associated with water. They're often in water, floating on liquids, etc. But I'd love to see, I have never seen a photograph of this with water flowing over it. And I don't know whether that's intentional, whether you're just not allowed to photograph it. I don't know. I'd like to, if anybody can find that out, let me know sometime. But anyway, the naga in the water, but you see, this is a little miniature temple. And my favorite figures are over here. See this little guy? This is our ascetic cat. It's a cat in yoga position, and these are little mice. I mean, there are little figures like this everywhere. They're not from a specific story. They're just fun little figures that somebody carved. Here we have a yogi up here, also standing in a yogic posture with a couple of ducks or whatever, and other dancing figures. You could, it's like walking around a Gothic cathedral trying to identify all the windows. What is going on here, and who is that? And it's sort of, you really have to take your time and your research material and go through and try and find out what everything was.
And you kind of have to know who was the builder and what was their particular thing. I mean, this may have been somebody's cat, you know, I mean, or the
Right.
the group that sponsored it or whatever, because everyone's different because of the circumstances in which it was built.
And you know, this was built over a long period of time. I mean, there could be 200 years in between these. Somebody comes along and adds this, and 50 years later, somebody adds that. So we're talking about, you know, that's different from the windows, which all went in roughly the same time. But this is something you just keep adding to. And I mean, someone could go back and finish this someday and add to it. But it has become a major site. It's rare to have this kind of granite outcroppings. It's on the coast. You only see it on the coast. We saw it, you know, areas along the coastal region. But that's about all. I think that's all we'll do today. We're in a good spot. I got an awful lot finished today. So we're in a good spot to finish up Hinduism, look at Muslim presence in India, and move to, then we've got plenty of time to finish up India. So I don't think we've really lost that much time. I don't think we're that far behind. So now, since I seem to be incapable of shutting up long enough for anybody to get questions in, does anybody have questions or comments about any of these things? Actually, with my new computer, I have the ability to jump back to any slide very easily without.
You know, I'm wondering if there are any other temples that have this kind of water feature, or is this completely unique?
As far as I know, it's pretty unique.
Huh.
I think it's taking advantage of this natural thing that happened, and then it got started. But I don't know of any that center on the idea of flowing water or anything like that. It seems to be taking advantage of a really special place.
How would the water feature work? Somebody, was there a water source on top? And then how would they prevent, if worshipers were at the bottom, they'd get flooded pretty quickly?
It's totally natural. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but there is a basin down here. It's cut down into the earth. I don't know where the water goes after that, but yeah, there's a pond up here. And in the rainy season, it will fill up and overflow and flow down into this cut area. I honestly don't know what happens to it at that point, whether it just fills up. And I mean, you think at some point either that must flow away somewhere to rejoin some river, or it would just overflow. So that I honestly don't know, but it's completely natural. The waterfall is. I have a feeling this recessed area is not natural. I think they probably dug that down, but I don't honestly know. I don't want to say.
I'm feeling to reproduce that in the city of fountains.
Yeah, go ahead, you know, go right ahead. Find a nice boulder somewhere and start carving. Yeah.
The caves.
Peggy, this is Jane.
Yeah.
This is an observation that I'd like you to comment on, but it probably is a class all unto itself. It seems like in Western art, there is such an accentuation of the differences between the male and the female figure. We see highly muscled men and very voluptuous women. Whereas in the Eastern art, there seems to be kind of a blurring of that. And the male
Right.
gods are very soft and effeminate looking. Can you
Yeah.
comment on that?
Well, it's a very, very old tradition. We come out of different contexts. We come out of the West, comes out of a Plato. I hate to blame him for everything, but it comes out of a totally different concept. And I think it's related to the sort of separation that takes place. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm just, saying the separation that takes place in the West between the physical and the spiritual. When Plato makes that distinction that these are inherently different things, and then later people come along and say not only are they different, but one is superior to the other, that the spiritual is superior, the earthly is not. That's when we get like differentiation. In Eastern philosophies, you never really get that separation, and the idea of balance is always there. I mean, we're going to see it in China, in the Tao and the conceptions of the Tao and the like, where difference isn't the driving force. And I think it's probably somewhere in there. It's also uniquely Indian. I mean, you're not going to see that so much in Chinese and Japanese art. I mean, it's Indian art where all the forms are sensual, where there's a sensuality. And I think Indian art is the most sensual art in the world. I don't think there's any culture anywhere that embraces that sort of sensuality in the figure. It's also somewhat our point of view to see that and recognize that point, where we're so used to, as you said, these distinctions that we're very conscious of it. My students were always asking why the figures were so effeminate, why these male figures, and they were all often identifying them as female, and that's just bias. That's just my culture taught me this is what men look like, as opposed to that. So I don't think they were trying to reference femininity or anything like that. I think it's just sort of deeply rooted in Indian culture. Anybody else got anything? Well, if not, please let me know if you haven't received these things. I will be happy to email them to you. If you want to either email me directly, or if you can put a note on the screen, that would be great. I'll make sure you get on the list. Other than that, that's all I have for today. So I'll see everybody next week.